everyone. Welcome to Crime in Court. This is the 1996 Menendez brothers retrial. Erik and Lyle on trial for the homicides of their parents, Kitty and Jose. We are on the defense's case, part 18, and this is Ron Linhart, still on the stand. I believe he is on cross still. So let's get right into it. I have a little bit of a different setup here. I switched my screen so that the one I'm reading from is the one where the camera's at. So let's see how that works. It's gonna take me a little bit to get used to my screen switched here. So, anyways, let's get started. Please hit the like button. We are continuing on from the morning break. We're on November 30th, 1995. Coming back from the morning break, the court says, okay, the defendants are present. Are we ready to proceed? Miss Abramson says, yes, Your Honor. Court says, the lawyers are all here. The witness is here. We'll get the jury out, please. The jury enters the courtroom, and the following proceedings were held. So the court says the jury is back in the box. You may continue your cross-examination. Mr. Khan, for the state, says, thank you, Your Honor. I have 4 photographs that I would like to mark at this time. The first one depicts Jose and Kitty Menendez in the den. Maybe that may be marked as, I believe it's 329. The court says 329 is next. Mr. Khan says, the next one is a close-up of Jose Menendez alone. May that be marked as 330. The next one depicts Kitty Menendez. May that be marked as 331. And the next one is a close-up of the feet area of Kitty Menendez. May that be marked as 332. Now, sir, during the break, did you have an opportunity to take a look at a couple of photographs? Yes, I did. Let me show you 2 photographs that have been marked which depict the body and the feet area of Kitty Menendez, 331 and 332. Are those 2 photographs that we discussed during the recess? Yes. Now, in one of those photographs, do you see what the previously described as evidence that Kitty Menendez, what you previously described as evidence that Kitty Menendez was in a standing or in an upright position at some point? Yes. And what is it that you're referring to? There are several blood patterns that support that conclusion. There are, okay, let me just identify. The one looking at right now is 332. What do you see in 332? 332 shows a close-up of her left shoe and leg, lower leg. That's the area of that photograph I'm focusing on. Go ahead. And what is it? There are blood drops that have dripped fairly straight down on the top of the shoe. Some area of blood was over that shoe, permitting the blood to fall straight down. There are blood stains on her left that have a direction along the line of the leg, so it came in from top to bottom. Perhaps we can put this up on the board. Once again, if you would take the marker and show the jury what areas you're referring to which indicate to you that Kitty Menendez was in an upright position at the time 1 or more shots were fired. Well, actually, my conclusion was just slightly different from as you just stated it. I was not referring to her position at the time that the shots were fired. I said she was in an upright position after the bleeding began. I can't place her position at an actual moment that any of the shots were fired. So even if she had been seated, she still would have had to stand up and get that blood spatter pattern, if you know what I'm saying. So the state's theory is that she was seated, so she'd still have to be up and mobile and moving and standing to get that pattern. So if she had been seated, that kind of blows their theory out of the water because she would have had to stand. Okay, so that would allow for the possibility that Kitty Menendez was initially seated on the sofa, and she was shot on the sofa, stood up, and some of the blood dripped onto her foot, onto her shoe, and ankle area. Is that correct? It's within the range of possibilities. I can't exclude that as a possibility. And directing your attention to other photographs that which is presently before you, 331, does that provide any additional evidence of blood drops indicating that Kitty Menendez was in an upright position sometime after receiving one or more wounds? Actually, the areas that I was looking at and considering are all contained within the other shot. These visible in this shot as well, or they're visible in this shot as well. Okay, let me put that one up for the jury. I take it that from the blood drops alone, you can't determine whether she was shot more than one time before she was in that upright position. Is that correct? No, I can't make that determination. All right. Then, turning to Jose Menendez, you also reached some conclusions regarding Jose Menendez at the time that you wrote your 1993 report, and you stated those conclusions in that report. Is that correct? That is correct. Do you have that report with you right now? Yes, I have it in front of me. Once again, can you tell us what conclusions you reached concerning Jose Menendez back in 1993? I concluded that Mr. Menendez's position was different from the position in which he was photographed at the scene at the time that certain of the gunshots were received, specifically the shot in the left elbow, the shot in the left leg, and the shot in the back of the head. I concluded that he was not in that position when he received the gunshot wound to, well, then restating what I just said. That's restating what I just said. I concluded that at some point after receiving the gunshot wound to the head, he was seated on the couch in a different position than he finally appeared. That is, further forward and somewhat to the right, to account for blood that appears on the cushion beside him on the side of the cushion, and at some point subsequently, he was moved to his final position as shown in the photographs. All right, let's take each of those statements one at a time. Your first statement that Jose Menendez was not in the position which he appears in the photograph at the time he received the shotgun wounds to the head, the left leg, and the elbow. And you suggested some possible positions. Is that correct? Well, I had some information that showed that confined his position subsequent to the shot to the head. I did not reflect in my report the variety of possible positions that he could have been in when he received the gunshot wounds to the leg or the elbow. All right. Well, let me start first with your statement that he was not in the position in which he appears in the photographs at the time he received the shotgun wound to the head. What was the basis for that conclusion? Okay. The lack of significant spatter directly on the back of the couch. I believe his head was further forward and the observation that he bled further to his right on the couch cushion. Okay. Let me put up a couple of photographs which I have just marked as 329 and 330, showing you these two photographs. Now, you're saying that in regard to the head wound, you did not see some spatter on the back of the sofa that you would expect to see if his head had been in that position when he was shot? Yes. From the placement of the wounds in the head relative to where it rests with regard to the back of the sofa and the pillow, I would have expected some spatter. If he were in just that position, I would place him somewhere or in a different position, if not location. So maybe he wasn't even sitting there when he was shot in the back of the head, perhaps, or sitting in a different position somehow. Anyways, so based upon your review of the physical evidence in this case, could he have been sitting upright or leaning a little bit forward at the time that he received the shot to the back of the head? Yes. So sitting upright or leaning a bit forward. Now, you said that he was not in the position which he appears at the time that he received the injury to the left leg. What was your conclusion? What was the basis for that conclusion? As I discussed earlier, that is a through and through wound. So there is an exit wound. The wound of that nature would necessarily carry blood and probably tissue out through the exit wound. That would be deposited along the trajectory of the shots. I explored the entire area that would have had to have been received that pattern had he been in that position. And there was no pattern of blood consistent with an exit wound in that area. Therefore, that must have gone elsewhere. Therefore, he must have been in a different position. Okay. Now, when you talk about in that position, you're referring to the exact position in which his left leg appears in that photograph. Is that correct? Well, yes. But I also considered whether just a simple reorientation of the leg with him sitting there like that was possible, and I couldn't find any spatter or the exit spatter that would act for that either. So his position was significantly different from what it was right there. Can you tell us what the position of his leg was at the time that shot was fired? Not with great certainty. There are several possibilities that I considered. One I consider to be the most probable. Now, did you see any evidence in these photographs of any spatter on the floor, any blood stains on the floor to away from the sofa there? That is, did you see any evidence of blood stains here from some distance away from the sofa? There are some blood stains on the carpet that are not directly underneath him that are at some distance from the sofa. Okay. Could that account for some blowout from that wound? No. Just flat out no. Those patterns that I observed there are a different character than I would see from the exit spatter from the wound. So you didn't get the answer you wanted from him there. Sorry, Mr. Khan. Okay, now do you recall you came to my office at one point and spoke with myself and Deputy District Attorney Carol Nahara? Yes? Do you recall telling us at the time? Ms. Abramson says, objection, Your Honor, hearsay, no foundation, no discovery. The court says, impeachment, overruled. Of course, it's overruled. Mr. Khan says, do you recall telling us at the time that the photographs in this case are lacking in sufficient detail to reach any conclusions concerning whether or not he was shot in a seated position? I don't recall stating just like that, no. Do you recall saying something like that? No, I believe that I stated it more akin to what I just stated in answer to the previous question that you asked, that I couldn't determine it definitely or definitively, but I did not have photos that covered every area of the room, but I had sufficient views of the area around the couch to exclude the exit spatter from being in that area, consistent with him being seated in that position. Now, during your review of the material in this case, did you become aware of a piece of tissue that was, I'll show you what has been marked as 299. Did you become aware of the fact that there was a piece of tissue which was located over by in the vicinity of the doors going into the den? In reviewing transcripts that I received, I saw reference to what one of the witnesses identified as a piece of tissue on the floor towards the door. And are you referring to the testimony of Detective Zoller? No, I haven't read Detective Zoller's testimony. Okay. And would that piece of tissue be consistent with blowout from one of the wounds in this case? If in fact it is a piece of tissue and I can't identify it as such from the photograph, and it was never tested, so we don't know. But if it is a single piece of tissue, that is not the type of pattern that one would observe from spatter from an exit wound. Assuming that that is a piece of tissue based upon your experience, can you tell us how that piece of tissue might have gotten there? Objection, Your Honor. Improper hypothetical, no foundation. Court says, rephrase the question, please. Mr. Khan says, yes. Based upon your experience, you indicated that you would not that would not be consistent with blowout? No. The exit spatter would not appear as a single piece of tissue, but it will appear as predominantly blood droplets of a variety of sizes and they will be projected onto some surfaces as blood drops. I would expect to see some tissue mixed with the blood drops. So you would expect that in severe gunshot wounds, you could have some tissue blown out from the body along with blood. Is that correct? Yes, such as an exit as that should carry some tissue as well as blood with it. Such an exit wound as that, sorry, such an exit wound as that would carry. I hate these all capital letters and I just, they all blur in my eyes. Okay. And do you believe that in this case, assuming that that is tissue and it is not blood drops, would such a location for that piece of tissue be consistent with blowout? Objection, Your Honor. Same objection, no foundation for the hypothetical. All right. Is there some assumption as to what that piece of material is? The court asks. Mr. Khan says, yes, assuming that that is a piece of flesh. That's what I'm objecting to, Your Honor. When you say flesh, can you be more specific? Asks the court. Mr. Khan says, yes, a piece of red human flesh observed by the investigating officer. The court says, not from any particular part of the body? No. Ms. Abramson says, still object as to no foundation, Your Honor. The court says, well, with that generalized description, some body tissue of some sort, if you can rephrase the question. The court says, I'll have to ask, or the witness says, I'll have to ask for the question to be re-asked. Mr. Khan says, yes, assuming that what you observed in that photograph at that location is in fact a piece of human flesh, would the location of that flesh be consistent with blowout in this case? I cannot identify the exit spatter as such from its location. I identify it from its pattern. Then from its location, I can sometimes work back to possible position of the exit wound relative to it, but I don't identify exit spatter from its location. I identify it from its pattern. Okay. Well, based upon location, do you have any idea, based upon your experience, as to how that piece of human flesh could have gotten to that location? Your Honor, I have to object again. The court says, yes, I think the testimony was some sort of body tissue without anything more specific. Mr. Khan says, well, provide additional testimony, or will provide additional testimony, Your Honor. Ms. Abramson says, I'm going to object to the counsel's remarks and ask that it be stricken. Court says, the remark is stricken. At this point, I believe the testimony was body tissue. I understand, Your Honor, says Mr. Khan. Ms. Abramson says, at this time, I'd ask to approach the bench vis-a-vis discovery. Court says, on this particular subject? Yes. At this point, in regard to the witness's testimony, the request is denied. Every time she asks to approach on a topic, she gets denied. She hasn't done it as much this trial so far. She's done it a few times and she always gets denied. And in the first trial, she originally, like, he started to give her when she would ask, he would let her approach on a lot of things, and then near the end of the trial, after I think tensions arose between the two, he stopped allowing her to approach. That's my observations. I can't confirm or deny that those were his reasons, but I think it got a little heated and he might have you know, been a little biased towards his feelings, or because of his feelings towards Leslie Abramson and her strong personality that kind of clashed with his on certain things. So that's kind of just my opinion. Every time she tries to approach, request is denied. Mr. Khan says, assuming that that is, in fact, a piece of human flesh, Ms. Abramson says, I'm going to make the same objection, Your Honor. Flesh is, I don't want to do a speaking objection. The court says, we've already been through this. It's unclear what you mean by flesh. Mr. Khan says, what I'm referring to is meat from the body. Oh my God. Just say tissue or something like flesh, meat from the body. They're grotesque. And they try to make it seem like the brothers were this violent, grotesque, uh, sadistic to the pair that they were making this horrific crime scene and, doing their worst, basically. And here we have the prosecutor himself calling a piece of biological material that may have been tissue from one of the victims. He's calling it human flesh, meat from the body. Not a good look. Anyways, it's on record for all of us to read 35 plus years later. Okay. let's let's move on. Ms. Abramson says, Your Honor, I'm going to object to that as non scientific. The court says again, if you want to identify specifically what you propose here, the best you can, assuming that I'll let you ask the question, but again, be as specific as you can. Assuming that what is observable there is tissue, which is neither hair nor bone nor skin, but muscle, would you be able to tell us, based upon your experience, how that piece of material could have gotten there based upon your observations of the photos of the crime scene in this case? No. That hypothetical assumption does not provide me with sufficient information to determine how that item got there. So he can't say one way or another. He doesn't think it's blowback, but he can't say how it got there. And when you expect, based upon your knowledge concerning blowout, that if a person seated in a position on the sofa were shot from the inside of the left leg towards the outside of the left leg, that the blowout from that shot could send a piece of that leg, a piece of flesh, over to the location where the material is apparent in the photograph? Under the conditions of what I observed here, the answer is no, because the rest of what I would have to observe for that to be true is absent in the intervening distance. So everything else that would need to be present for that type of wound or blowout, whatever they're calling it, blowout from the wound, isn't present. So maybe an investigator carried a piece of tissue or something inadvertently when they were at the crime scene. Who knows? We don't know. That's the whole point. Things were not investigated properly or vetted properly, photographed properly. All sorts of things were not done properly. Tested. They don't even know if it was tissue. Was it even collected? We don't know. I mean, they're just literally going off of a photo and saying, oh, there's a piece of something here in this area, but we can't tell what it is. And we didn't test it, we didn't collect it, but just trust us, it's tissue. And it got there because of blowout. No, not going to happen. Okay, moving on. He says under the conditions, he says, no, that's not what it is. Well, did you see any evidence you've indicated that all of the shots fired at Mary Menendez were fired, in your opinion, while she was on the sofa or between the sofa and the coffee table? Is that correct? In that area, either standing or sitting on the couch or the floor in that area between the table and the sofa. Okay. Now, did you see any evidence based upon your review of the photographs in this case that Jose Menendez ever moved from the location in which he is depicted in that photograph? I also confined his location once the shooting started, once he began bleeding, to be the area of the couch and the floor between the couch and the coffee table. Okay. The floor between. Let me go to another photograph now. When you say you confined his area to the floor between the couch and the coffee table, let me direct your attention to what has been marked as 37. Can you tell us specifically by reference to that photograph what area you confined his mobility to? Would you like me to circle it? Yes, if you would, please. Ms. Amerson says, was that 87, did you say? That was 37, Mr. Khan says. She says, thank you. The witness says, you just mean for me to circle the floor area, is that correct? Yes. Where you can find his area of mobility. I thought this photograph would be better. This is 37 here. The witness says, all right, I may need to look at some other photographs to capture all the blood stains. Okay, I've drawn an area extending essentially adjacent to the area previously circled on this photograph, extending from the right edge of the first couch cushion or a little beyond, encompassing the area to the coffee table and extending across to an area just left of the couch. Okay, thank you. And you limited that area to uh, you limited it to that area because you observed no evidence of blood from Jose Menendez in this area that I am now pointing to, which is the left-hand corner of 37. Is that correct? I did not observe blood spatter in that area. I wasn't able to determine specifically whose blood was in most locations. Now, given the fact that you limit the mobility of Kitty Menendez to the area that you indicated, and given the fact that you limited the mobility of Jose Menendez to the area that you indicated, do you have any opinion concerning how that material, which was previously identified as a piece of tissue, may have ended up by the door? From the information given to me, which is in the hypothetical that you gave, I do not have sufficient information to draw any conclusions regarding that. So, can't answer you. F off, buddy. Do you know of any type of professional other than yourself who can shed some light on how that type of body part could have ended up over the door or by the door? Sorry. Based upon the information that you gave me, I would think not. Now, you said that Jose Menendez was not in the position which he now appears in the photograph at the time that the wound to the left elbow was received. He was not in the position that he was found when the wound to the left elbow was received. Is that correct? That's correct. And what do you mean by that? The wound area in the left elbow is below the arm of the couch. For him to have been in that position would have required the pellets penetrating the couch and I could see no evidence in the photographs that the wounds in his left elbow came through the couch. Therefore, the elbow must have been positioned differently. Okay. So, if at the time that shot was received, he was seated on the sofa, but his elbow was in a raised position, would that account for that wound? That would be a permitted configuration. Okay. Now, after making the observations in your 1993 report that he was not in the position in which he appears at the time those wounds were received, you then state, do you not, in the next sentence, that he was either sitting on the west end of the couch, standing in front, or moving between and sitting and a standing position. Is that correct? Yes. At the time that the wounds were received, that's collectively all those wounds. Okay. So were you saying in this sentence that he could have been seated at the time that all the wounds were received? No, I don't believe that's the case. Okay. Can you tell us why you chose the language he was either sitting on the west end of the couch, standing in front, or moving between a seating and standing position? Yes, that was based upon the question that was addressed to me as to whether there was evidence of confrontation, and in order to provide information that might permit argument to address that, I sought to confine the area of his movement during the course of the shooting. For that purpose, I did not go into greater detail shot by shot in my report. Although in your report you did indicate that the stated purpose was to reconstruct the locations and positions at the time the wounds were received. Is that correct? Yes. And now what you're saying is back in 1993 you were in the position that he was not seated at the time of the wounds. All the wounds were received. You did not state that in your report. Objection argumentative overruled. The witness says, with regard to one specific wound, I don't believe he could have been seated at that time. With regard to and that's the leg wound. With regard to the other wounds, the head wound and the wounds to both arms, I cannot exclude him being seated at the time. Now, you said that your next conclusion in your 93 report is that he was, for a time, after receiving the wound to his head, sitting on the couch, leaning further forward and more to his right than shown in the photographs. Is that correct? That's correct. And the reason for that conclusion is because of the pooling of blood that you observed on the sofa? Actually, blood flow on the sofa. Okay. Let me go to the other photographs. The blood flow that you're referring to is this blood flow that appears along the right side? Yes, and actually over the edge of the sofa and down into the crevice between the two cushions. Okay. And you concluded at the time that because there was a blood flow over the cushion, that therefore his head had to have been above that position at the time of the blood flow? Yes. You are aware of the fact that he also received some wounds to his right arm? Yes, I am. And can you determine from looking at the photographs whether the blood flow that you're referring to there came from his head or from his right arm? I do have an opinion on that based upon the quantity of the blood that I observed there. And that opinion is what? That quantity of blood is more consistent with his head wounds, since his head wounds bleed much more profusely than wounds to other parts of the body because of the greater blood supply. What is the quantity of blood that pooled on the cushion there? In terms of volume measurement? Yes. I cannot measure the exact volume. I'm making that as a relative amount of blood. The appearance is a substantial quantity of blood to have flowed down over the edge of the couch and also down over his body. There could be some contribution from the arm wound, but the general amount appears to be too great to be consistent with that alone. Okay. Now, are you aware of the size of the wound that he received to that arm? I've seen photographs of it, yes, and read the autopsy protocol. And it was a rather large wound that he received to his right arm, is that correct? It was a through and through shotgun wound. It was. Is it your opinion then that a through and through shotgun wound to the arm could not leave enough blood on the surface of that cushion such that it might have flowed down to in between the two cushions? It would require some time for that to have occurred, with him still alive, for that to have happened. It's the impression. The quantity of blood appears greater than I would account for the arm wound alone. Therefore, I believe the head wound contributed to that because of the quantity. I mean, he's got excellent answers to these questions that make logical sense to me. Well, when you consider the quantity of blood, are you also considering the amount of blood, which is on the sofa on the cushion and has not sped over in between the two cushions? Seeped. That is not seeped into the two cushions. He says, I'm looking at the total blood pool. Okay. That total blood pool can consist of both blood from his right arm and blood from his head, can't it? Very probably so. Is there any way for you to distinguish how much of that particular blood pool came from his right arm and came from his head? No, I can't divide out the blood in specific volumes of how much is head wound or how much is arm wound, nor can I in the surface area. Isn't it possible that a great amount of the blood which appears on the top of the cushion would have come from his head wound and only that portion spilling over in between the cushions came from his arm wound? As I said, the total volume of blood that's over the edge of the couch and over the edge of the cushion and between the cushions is greater than I would expect from the arm wound alone. I would expect the head wound to be contributed to that. Okay, I'll show you what has been marked as 183. And you're aware you've seen that photograph before? Yes, I have. And you're aware that that's a photograph which depicts the injury to his right arm? Yes. And given the fact that you cannot, well, can you tell us how much blood actually seeped over in volume? How much blood actually seeped over and between the cushions? No. Again, I didn't make any effort to do the experiments that would be required to specifically estimate the volume. It was an impression based upon the relative quantity that I observed there. So, if you excluded the possibility that what happened here was that he was shot in the arm and just the blood from his arm seeped down in between the cushions and the rest of the blood which we see there on the surface of the cushion is blood from his head? Yes, based upon the quantities that are there in that pool, I don't believe that's likely. Right, but have you excluded it? Absolutely excluded it. Perhaps not. I consider it highly unlikely. Now, in your third sentence of the same paragraph of the conclusions that you reached concerning Jose Menendez in 1993, I believe you said that he was subsequently moved to his final position either by another person or by the shots fired into his right arm. Is that correct? And that's what I stated in my report. What did you mean by that? That since he was further forward and to his right at one time after receiving the head wound, he was not capable of voluntarily moving to another position because the head wound was immediately and totally incapacitating, that some other agency caused him to be moved to the final position. At that time, I attribute it rather generically to either additional shotgun wounds or the act of another person. In retrospect, I would probably limit it just to the act of another person. I suspect that the additional shotgun wounds are an unlikely possibility. So you believe that he was perhaps pushed back into that position? Yes, that could have happened, or he could have been bumped, which could cause sufficient motion to cause him to settle back. Okay, now I believe that you stated in your direct examination that you respect the work of Dr. Golden. Is that what you said? I don't recall how I worded it, but I generally have a good regard for his skills as a forensic pathologist. I've worked with him on a number of occasions. And you are sufficiently familiar with the body of work by Dr. Golden to make that remark? By the body of work, if you mean all the cases he has done, no. I have worked with him on a number of cases, and based upon my experiences with him, have good regard, generally, for his skills as a forensic pathologist. Are you familiar with the criticisms that were leveled against Dr. Golden in connection with the O.J. Simpson case? Ms. Abramson says, objection, Your Honor, irrelevant, hearsay. Court says, well, the witness has not testified about reputation, only his own personal opinion based upon his experiences with Dr. Golden. Objection sustained. Mr. Khan says, based upon your review of the coroner's reports, did you receive all of the amendments to the coroner's reports? No, I did not. What did you review then? I reviewed the original coroner's report at the time that I did my reconstruction. Did you know that since 1993, Dr. Golden amended his report? Yes, I am aware that there have been amendments. And have you asked to see a copy of those reports? No, I have not. Do you feel that that might be helpful to any of your testimony here in court? No, within the confines of the opinions that I reached, the issues that were being discussed would not have been relevant to the defining my conclusions. Now, in regard to the left leg wound to Jose Menendez, I believe that you said that you observed some blood drips on the floor near that leg wound. Is that correct? Yes, there is in fact a pool of blood on the floor underneath the leg wound, and there are some blood drops that appear to have been dripping straight down due to the force of gravity in the area near that blood pool. Okay, now those blood drops alone do not tell you that Jose Menendez was standing at the time that the shot to the leg was received, does it? No, they don't. Okay, and why is it that they do not allow you to draw that conclusion? They could have dripped from that wound with the leg moved to a slightly different position, or they could have dripped from another wound. I cannot determine the precise source of the body from whence they came. And how far from the sofa did you observe the dripping of that wound? Again, there are no scales in the photographs I observed, so I can make no measurements. And are all of those drops that you see there consistent with, well, both referring both to the separate drops of blood, and well, as to the small pool of blood that you see there, is that all consistent with bleeding from the wound? I can't exclude all of that blood from having come from that single wound. I just can't conclude that it necessarily must have. Now, assuming that the shot to the back of the head of Jose Menendez, which you testified would create some sort of spatter, do you mean by the use of the term blowback from the head wound? Yes, it's a little bit different from a confined entry wound. A single projectile causes an entry wound where you can get a different kind of blowback in some cases than would be expected and was observed here from the escape of gases from the contact wound to the head. So it's a different kind of blowback than just from a single projectile entry. Well, based upon your review of the photographs, how much of a blowback or how much of a spatter would you anticipate from that head wound? The one that he received, I would have expected it to be rather extensive. What do you mean by extensive? There should be a significant amount of blood, and in this case, tissue, that was projected upon the wound. Let me show you some of the exhibits that were shown to you by defense counsel. I want to direct your attention first to the exhibit that is marked 304. I believe that you said that you observed in regard to the photographs of the wound to the left leg of Jose Menendez smearing. I'm sorry, but I believe that you said in relationship to the right leg wound, you observed some smearing, and that would be here in photograph B along his right leg. Is that correct? Yes, I was asked about that particular blood smear. Okay, and can you tell us what could cause that particular smearing that you're referring to? I could give you some possibilities, but I cannot tell you specifically what did cause it. Okay, did you tell us what those possibilities could be? Can you tell us? It could have come either one or both, from one or both hands. There is blood on his hands. It could come from some other configuration of the legs relative to each other than just bringing the thighs together, since the companion smear appears to be absent in the opposite area of the left leg. It could have come from some secondary transfer from some blood contaminated object, such as the couch. There are some conceivable relative positions there. It's just that there are so many possibilities that I can't really conclude how that blood was transferred and smeared. And you can't tell us which wound to the body of Jose Menendez caused that smear, can you? No, I can't. Okay, and that wound, the smear that you see there, would be consistent, for example, with Jose Menendez being shot in his right arm and then touching his leg after he touched his right arm. Is that correct? I can't exclude that as a possibility. Well, let me show you another photograph. I'm showing you what has been marked as 319. Now, here you testified in regard to some smears on the sofa that appear in photographs A and B. Is that correct? Yes. And you said that those marks which you observed there are contact transfers. Is that correct? Yes, they are. And now the photographs of Kitty Menendez depict her very close to that particular smear location. Is that correct? Objection, Your Honor. Assumes facts not in evidence. Overruled. The witness says, in the photograph showing her final position, portions of her body are on the floor in front of and underneath that area of contact transfer. So what would you estimate to be the distance in photograph 329 between the left hip area of Kitty Menendez and that area of contact transfer that you're referring to? Which one specifically? There are several. Well, the closest one? Yes, I'm referring to this one here. This large area that appears to have contact transfer both on the bottom of the sofa and then as well as the upper cushion. Again, without scales, it would be just a very rough estimate that I could provide, but from the appearance, it appears to be in the neighborhood of a foot or perhaps a little less. Okay. And would that contact transfer be consistent with Kitty Menendez after she has been shot lying on the floor, brushing her left hip up against the side of the sofa? She Portions of it could result from that. It would require more than just a raising of the body to deposit the contact transfers that appear on the top surface of the couch. Let me put up the large photograph of the sofa once again. All right, now you're saying that there are portions of this stain here, which is photograph B in 319, would be consistent with Kitty Menendez brushing up against the sofa after she had been shot. Is that correct? All of them are consistent with her at some point after she begins bleeding, brushing the respective areas of the sofa where the contact transfers appear. Okay, so all of the stains that you see on that cushion and on that sofa are consistent with Kitty Menendez brushing up against it after she has fallen to the floor. Is that correct? Well, we would know whose blood it is if you guys had tested it, but you didn't. If she got back up after she fell to the floor, then that's consistent. Not all of it is accessible to her once she's down on the floor. Simply by elevating the body, she would have had to have gotten up to some greater extent to have deposited the blood on the top surface. Right. Although some of the surfaces on the top surface are consistent with her touching the surface with her hand, is that correct? We, yes, I can't tell you what portion of her body, if it was in fact her body, that created any of that contact transfer. Right. So you can't say just from looking at the smears on the sofa that she was necessarily on the sofa at the time that any of these shots were fired, can you? That is correct. I can't say that. Okay. Now, you also indicated that there was blood and tissue which were spattered on the walls and the ceiling. Yes. And how do you know it was tissue? By the irregular configuration of the spattered drops. They had the same configuration I have seen in other cases with spattered tissue, where I was able to observe the actual drop before closely and see that irregular shape was caused by a mixture of blood and tissue. It had that appearance, and from the photographs I recognized the pattern, and under the circumstances here, with the head wound that Mr. Menendez had received, concluded that that was what created those drops with that particular regular configuration. Okay, and where inside the room did you observe the blood and tissue spatter? They were predominantly on the south wall. There was distributed on to other walls and on the ceiling, and there was additional drops on the floor behind the couch as well. When you say other walls, are you saying that there was blood or tissue on the west wall or the east wall? I'd have to review the photographs again at this point to see whether the particular drops that contained both blood and tissue extended onto the west and east walls. There was spatter that extended onto the walls. There was what? There was spatter that extended onto the walls, the other walls. Would that is would that assist you in any way? That is, the various locations of the blood and tissue assist you in any way in determining, as you set out to do in your 93 report, to reconstruct the locations and positions of the infliction of the shotgun wounds in this case? I did. It did, in fact, assist me. That was part of the foundation I used for the conclusion I did reach, that in confining him to that location. So that though the blood spatter on the other walls is part of what helped him conclude the area where Jose was located. What I looked for there was to see if there was any of the projected spattered blood that was inconsistent with that location, since the characteristic of those drops weren't adequate for me to do specific angle measurements, and the photographs were not adequate for that purpose either. I was unable to confine his location without evidence. What I looked for was any of that inconsistent with the other evidence confining his location to the area in front of the couch, and it was not. Okay. So, what evidence was consistent with your findings? With your findings that Kitty and Jose Menendez, that their mobility was confined, as you indicated here in your testimony today. Is that correct? Yes, that was part of the evidence that I considered in reaching that conclusion. Okay, let me show you some photographs. Now, in regard to Exhibit 295, I believe that you testified that in looking at that blood spatter which appears on the shirt of Jose Menendez, that is, his left side, you were able to determine the direction of the travel of that blood. Is that correct? Yes. Some of the drops show directional character, and from those, I was able to determine the direction of travel of those portions of the pattern at least. Okay. Now, would you expect when you look at blood spatter, the way that you determined that there is a direction in is because you see some sort of tail at one side of the blood? Is that correct? Yes, that's a fair description of part of what I'm looking at in determining the direction of blood of travel. Okay. And the tail that you observed by which you determined direction is what you might call a forward tail. In other words, in the direction of travel. Is that correct? Yes. That's what essentially it is a secondary cast off from the major drop. Major drop does travel in the direction of travel of the drop. What? I don't understand any of that. Oh well. Now, would you expect that if you were to attribute, let me rephrase that, would you expect that if all of the blood that we see here was attributed to a single shot, that you would see a tail on each and every single shot, each and every single one of these drops that we see on his shirt? No, on a surface such as that, I wouldn't necessarily expect that. Why is that? It's an irregular surface. These are multiple possible configurations with wrinkles in the shirt so that the actual angle with respect to the particular spot on the shirt can vary somewhat. So all I can see is an overall direction of the travel of that pattern. Not all of the drops will preserve that directional characteristic. Okay, now just from looking at the spatter that you see in this shirt, were you able to determine which wound to which person caused that spatter? No, I didn't reach any conclusion on that. Okay, so one of the possibilities that was suggested to you by defense counsel was that that might have been caused by a wound to the right arm of Jose Menendez. Is that correct? That's correct. But actually, just looking at that spatter, you can rule out the possibility that that was caused by, for example, the wound to Kitty Menendez at the time that she was near Jose Menendez. Is that correct? I did not rule that out, no. Thank you. I have no further questions. Any redirect? Ms. Abramson says, yes, Your Honor. All right, so redirect begins. Ms. Abramson says, Mr. Linhart, you had access both to the actual photograph, the print photographs, and the computerized version of the photographs. Which did you find, if either, more helpful in your ability to gain information about the details of this crime scene? Well, I prefer using the actual photographic prints. That's what I did in my original work on this case. From the photographs on the CD were sufficient. Okay, I don't know. The photographs on the CD were sufficient for just refreshing my recollection. But I didn't like working with them, wouldn't like working with them for an original reconstruction. And why is that? What's the advantage to having the actual hard photographs? Well, one of the primary advantages is that I can look at multiple photographs simultaneously. I can lay out as many as I want. Since it's very difficult to retain in memory the minute detail from photograph to photograph, I can actually compare photographs that show slightly different views of the same thing to get more information. And was your purpose in looking at the photographs and doing that to gain as much information about the various details of the crime scene evidence here as you could? Well, yes. I wanted to be familiar with all of the blood patterns so that I could address in as much detail as I could the questions that were asked me, and perhaps more importantly, ensure that none of the conclusions I reached were inconsistent with the evidence. And so, to make sure that you're not inconsistent with the evidence, you try to look at everything within your area of expertise, correct? That's correct. Do you think anyone could effect a true reconstruction of this crime scene who had no expertise in blood spatter or choose to ignore the blood spatter evidence? Objection, argumentative, assumes facts not in evidence. Court says it's also compound as phrased also. Samerson says, do you believe that any viable reconstruction of any aspect of this shooting could be accomplished by ignoring the blood spatter evidence? Objection, assumes facts not in evidence. Overruled. Well, there's some limited facts that could be determined without the blood spatter evidence. However, since there is a lot of blood patterns around, they certainly contribute to an understanding of what occurred here, and I would consider it ill advised to attempt to reconstruct events without considering that piece of evidence. And all the various areas where blood spatter evidence is observable at this scene? Well, both where blood spatter evidence is observable and where blood spatter evidence is not observed. One should look at both. In fact, your conclusions regarding Mr. Menendez's leg wound, that is based, is it not, on the absence of blood spatter evidence, which you believe should have been there, correct? Based in part upon that, it's not the totality of the foundation, but that was a consideration. You indicated in reference or in response to Mr. Khan's questioning that you believe that Mr. Menendez was in a significantly different position at the time he received that leg wound and that there was several possibilities, but there was one that you thought was most probable. Do you recall that? Yes, I do. I'll ask you, what is the one that you think is more probable? Okay, may I refer to one of the photographs? Certainly. To explain the foundation for why I believe that? Certainly. Is it a photograph that's observable right now, or do you need to move something? He says, I can see the photograph, but it doesn't provide the best shot. If we have a close-up that shows the area of the couch between Mr. Menendez's legs, that would best demonstrate it. Yes, I believe you'll find that that's on, we'll put out the one that says 7. There's a close-up here, I think. Does this help, or is that good enough? So he's comparing images of the bottom portion of the couch right now where Jose's legs are to compare blood pattern and also lack of blood pattern. So he's comparing one picture of Jose's legs there present still on the couch, and then another picture where it's just the couch and the body's already been removed. So he can identify different markings there. Um, so let's make sure you know which one that is. They're not marked on the front. You're referring to photograph number 330? Yes. Photograph number 330 does show some projected blood on the front edge of the couch between Mr. Menendez's legs. While I cannot see enough of that pattern to conclude definitively that that is a result of exit spatter from the leg wound, that is consistent with being a portion of that pattern. Since I don't see the patterns anywhere else, that leads me to consider that the most probable location where that exit spatter went. For that to have been achieved, Mr. Menendez would have been standing with his left leg oriented with the outside of the leg towards the couch, either standing or partially standing. I can't say how far he had gotten into the standing position, but the area of the exit wound of the exit would need to have been at least as high as the front edge of the couch. The area of the couch cushion where the remainder of that pattern would have gone if that, in fact, is the exit spatter, is subsequently obscured by the additional bleeding, the pooling of blood under his body. So I can't see whether the entire pattern is there or not. For that reason, I stop short of concluding necessarily that that's what occurred, but I find no more likely alternative for the evidence. So that's the most likely alternative that you find from the evidence, that he was most probably standing in front of that couch, standing or somewhere between a sitting and standing position. Perhaps, that's what he says, standing or somewhere between a standing and sitting position, he says. Perhaps sinking, had been standing. Objection leading. Can I finish the question? Go ahead, finish. Thank you. Is it consistent with a scenario in which he had been standing, received wounds, and is starting to sink down into a seating position? That would be within the range of possibilities. I can't tell from that whether he is a stationary position or moving either from a sitting or standing, or standing to sitting. If he's moving from sitting to standing or standing to sitting, he can't tell. Any one of those three is consistent with your findings on the spatter evidence? Yes. And concerning that area of blood spotting, you can only see a bit, I think, in 330. There are two distinct areas where there appear to be droplets of a kind to be formed by dropping straight down near Mr. Menendez's position on the couch. Is that correct? Could you say that again? There are two areas, strike that. You previously indicated there's an area here. You indicated it in the other circling that you did. There's an area here, sort of along this parallel line border of the carpeting that you can see here, where it goes from blue to white, where the carpet goes from blue to white. Yes, there's an area of blood drops there, closer to the cabinet. And then there's an area of straight down blood drops which are adjacent to, and some are in front of, the pool of blood that's directly beneath Mr. Menendez's leg. Yes, that's correct. And those also appear to be individual droplets that came from above. That's correct. If we can imagine then, hypothetically, Mr. Linhart, what we were just talking about, Mr. Menendez is standing up in front of the couch when he receives the leg wound, but a portion of his or his other limbs have also been shot. Could these droplets here be consistent with, for example, his right arm dripping at the time when he was receiving the wound to the left leg, so that you see the potential blowout pattern of that on the couch? Let me see if I understand the proposed situation. That he has already received the wound to his right arm? Correct. It would be possible to configure him in a partial standing position with leaning forward with the right arm over the area where the blood drops are observed uh, near the coffee table. Right. So that remains within the range of possible scenarios. I can't conclude that that's actually what happened. Okay. But it is a possible scenario that the right arm is dripping in that area where there's blood, and the left leg wound is producing a pattern that you see on the couch cushion. Yes, that's within the range of possibility. Are you aware that in the amendment that Dr. Golden wrote in 1995, he clarifies that the upper arm wound to Mr. Menendez passes from basically outside to inside? Objection assumes facts not in evidence. The witness indicated he didn't read that amendment. The court says, all right, let's see if you can establish a foundation that he has considered that in any way. Ms. Abramson says, well, I want to ask you first if you're aware that that was one of the, that was something that appeared in the amendments. You said you were aware that there were amendments. Did you read the amendments? Asks the court. The witness says, I have not. Were you told by anyone connected with this case that there was such an amendment? Yes. And who told you that, if you recall? I believe that I was told by Mr. Khan that there were amendments to that report when we met. And did Mr. Khan indicate that one of the amendments had to do with the upper arm wound where Dr. Golden clarified? Objection assumes facts not in evidence and calls for hearsay. That the wound overruled. Go ahead. Thank you, Your Honor. That the wound was from outside the upper arm to inside the upper arm. I understood that that the amendments addressed the wounds into the right arm, but quite frankly, I don't recall all the details of that. Just to get back to the manner in which you framed your original conclusions, looking at the position that Mr. Menendez is in on the couch, his final position, and assuming that what we see here, this wound that we see here, is the exit wound, and that the entry wound would be behind the surface of the arm that we see here, and further assuming, hypothetically, that there is no shot through the back of the couch, do you follow what I'm saying? Yes, I do. In your opinion, could that right arm wound have been administered while Mr. Menendez was in the position that we see him pictured in 330? No. Now, is there anything in the evidence as you examined it that precludes Mr. Menendez from standing when he was receiving all of the wounds, with the exception of the head wound? No, I can't exclude a standing position for the leg wound or the wound on the left arm or the right arm. And with respect to Mrs. Menendez, you testified that, and I think you circled on the photograph to the left, uh, and I just have to keep checking the numbers. I'm sorry. This is 322, Exhibit 22, and you circled these areas on the east portions of the sectional sofa that have some blood spatter as indicative that at least a part of her body was close to the floor at the time that it received a shot which caused that splatter, correct? Yes. Would you call that a large amount of blood spatter, or is it a modest quantity of blood that appears in that spatter? Well, large and modest, again, are relative terms. It's not a great quantity of blood. There are other numbers of drops of various sizes in that area, but in terms of overall volume of blood, it's not a great deal of blood. So if that blood that's on the couch from Kitty is supposed to be the blowback from the shot to her face, and there's not a lot of blood, she likely got that when she was dead or already on her way out. I mean, for lack of a better term, where she would have already been very much bled out at that point, and a shot to her head wouldn't have caused, a ton of bleeding, which head wounds do. So it could have been that she was shot when she was already dead or possibly near death. Is the volume that appears there more consistent with her receiving two wounds to the body while parts of her body are close to the floor as compared to 6 or 11 or 7? 6 or 7? Well, in fact, I can't determine the number of wounds. I see nothing in the pattern that actually suggests more than one event causing the spatter, but it's possible for there to be more than one event that caused the spatter. But really, it's consistent with one event specifically and possibly more, but I can't determine the number. In fact, that area is also observable, is it not, at the top of the photograph that's been marked 331, which is the one that I'm now positioning on the board. Here is the same area, correct? I can see the area. I'll have to get closer to actually see the blood drops. Shines a lot. It's not necessarily the shine as it is my vision. Yes, I can see it well there. And you can see it there at the top end. Now, can I call your attention to an area between her two legs and an area adjacent to where her right leg is shown in this photograph? Yes, I see that. Do you have any opinion about what the little circles are in those areas? You mean the stains that appear as blood drops? Well, that was what I said. Are those stains that appear as blood drops? Yes, they Most of them appear as blood drops. There's something else there in the photograph that this almost looks like a coin, perhaps. A dime, perhaps? But there are a number of stains appearing in blood drops and looking as blood drops or drips straight down. That came straight down? Yes. You don't know whose blood that is, whether it's Mr. Menendez's blood or Mrs. Menendez's blood. No, I have no opinion on that. But it's within that area that you believe both of them were in at that time that they were shot. That's correct. Do you also see farther up in the photograph some circular areas? Yes, I do. Did you form the opinion that these also appear to be blood drops? Those are also consistent in appearance with that, yes. When we talk about blood drops, we mean the kind that come straight down. Yes. And that would appear without measuring the sofa at least to be several feet away from each other. Yes, again, I don't have the actual measurements, but it is several feet at least. The photograph that appears, the small photograph that's up on the board, that appears to be a coroner's photograph. You've seen that before, have you not? Yes. Do you understand that the wound to Mr. Menendez's arm, as shown there, as described by Mr. Khan, is very large, has been dissected before that photograph was taken? Yes, I recognize that it had been dissected. Thank you. Now, you have indicated that you could tell from some of the scene photographs that there appear to be portions of the body tissue that were on the ceiling. There was some spatter on the ceiling, at least one of those that I recall, and I would have to look again at the photographs to see the total extent was a mixture of blood and tissue. Is it your opinion that the source of material that would go that far would most likely be the head wound to Mr. Menendez, or could that have been from other wounds that were inflicted to either of the decedents in this case? After reviewing the totality of the wounds delivered in this case, it's my opinion that that spatter was from the head wound to Mr. Menendez. Mr. Linhart, within the area that you have described as that area in which you believe both decedents were mobile during the shooting, do you have any idea how many possible combinations of body movements one could say each of them could have taken during the shooting? Well, the possible configurations are literally infinite. This is now, I don't know, at least the third witness for the defense that has said the possibilities are limitless, infinite. You can't, the positioning, because the decedents were moving and the shooters were moving, the possibilities, we can't even fathom how many possibilities there are. And it can't be recreated or reconstructed. So this is now, I think, the third defense witness that has said literally infinite numbers of possibilities of configurations here. He says, because there was, in fact, an infinite number of positions between any 2 points, it's an infinite number of possible configurations. Is there sufficient evidence? Do you believe there's sufficient evidence here to decide that either one of them was in a specific position at the time they received all but the head wounds? What I mean by the head wounds is the contact wound. Each had let me start with this. You recall that each had a contact wound. Yes. And each of those contact wounds was described by the coroner as immediately fatal. All right? Okay. And in fact, one of them has since been described by the coroner as probably perimortem or postmortem. Okay. That's the only perimortem or postmortem wound in the entire scene. Okay? Yes. Is it fair then to assume, based on everything else that you've seen here, that each of those wounds, those contact head wounds, were the last wounds that each of the victims received? Given that none of the other wounds are post mortem, Those would be consistent with being the last wounds. Whether there are other remote possibilities, I would prefer to defer that kind of conclusion to a forensic pathologist. So he doesn't step out of his lane when it's beyond his scope. Gotta love an expert that knows his role and doesn't back down on what he's saying. And if indeed, for example, the head wound to Mr. Menendez is the last wound, would you say it's unlikely that his body would have moved much from where you see it in the photographs? Well, he wouldn't have moved far from the couch. He could have had some positional movement as he sat on the couch following that, and in fact, I believe he did. Maybe like head tilted, probably tilted to the side, fell back. I don't know. Um, not a, I can't, I'm not a reconstructionist, but I can see how that could happen. How the fatal blow might not have been the position he might not have been in the position when he got the fatal blow, but the fatal blow possibly could have moved his body. The force from that could have moved his body in such a way that we couldn't predict. Anyways, all right, especially if we don't know where he was sitting and where the shooter was. Well, he would have had he wouldn't have moved far from the couch. He would have had some positional movement as he sat on the couch following that, and in fact, I believe he did. He did move, he thinks. Okay, we'll talk about that for a moment. That's what you think. It might have been caused by a bumping of the couch? Bumping of the couch or him directly, I can't distinguish between them, but those are possible events that could have moved him. Okay. With respect to Mrs. Menendez, if the left cheek contact wound was a perimortem or postmortem wound, you wouldn't expect any movement by her after that. Objection assumes facts, not an evidence. The court says you're asking him to assume that? Yes, Your Honor, I am asking him to assume that. Overruled. In fact, it was post or perimortem, says the witness, and it's kind of self evident that she could not have moved. So, post or perimortem, meaning she was probably already dead or in the process of dying. And it's kind of self evident that she could not have moved on her own volition following that. Miss Emerson says, okay. So, with the exception of those two wounds, which, by what we've just said, have to be inflicted when each of the decedents was more or less in the position that they're found, is there anything in the evidence that indicates where they were when any of the other wounds were inflicted? I cannot, apart from the general described area that you have shown. I cannot definitively locate the position nor location at the time of any of the other wounds, with the possible exception of my preferred general location for the leg wound of Mr. Menendez. Right. But I don't consider that conclusive. That's just what I see as the most likely location. Is there anything in the evidence that you studied that would exclude Mrs. Menendez from standing up when she received most of the wounds to her body? Let me reread that. Is there anything in the evidence that you studied that would exclude Mrs. Menendez from standing up when she received those wounds? I would not be able to conclude either that or conclude differently. I simply can't tell. There's nothing in the evidence that suggests that she, for example, could not have been standing up when she received the wounds to the right side of her face. I found nothing in the evidence, nothing that would eliminate that as a possibility. Anything that would eliminate the possibility that she's standing up when she receives the wound to her right arm, the double wound to her right arm. Again, I found nothing in the evidence that would eliminate that as a possibility. Is there anything you found in the evidence that eliminates the possibility that she could have been standing up when she received the wound to her left breast? No. Let me ask you this. Is there anything in the evidence that in any way informs you on the questions of whether she could have been, in fact, reclining on the couch or had her body in some way on the couch when she received the wound to her thigh that Mr. Khan has drawn your attention to. A wound that's shown in this area where you see a tear in the fabric of her pants. In this area, there's a high wound. Is there anything that precludes her from, in fact, having been reclining for however long on the sofa when she received that wound? Well, certainly not in the bloodstain patterns. I would have to study the information on the wound itself to address it further, but the bloodstain patterns don't exclude that as a possibility. And if in fact she received, say, a wound to her calf and a wound to her thigh while on the couch and then slid off the couch, could that explain this? These stains, these contact smears that you have previously testified about? That's within the range of possibility. The court says, how much longer do you think you have? Not much, Your Honor. Perhaps if we could just go a few more minutes. He says, is there going to be some further redirect? Mr. Khan says, yes. He says, we'll do it at 1:30. Don't discuss the matter with anybody. He just cuts off the defense. She said only a few more minutes, and he cuts her off in the middle of something. So maybe she was leading up to something, and he cut her off, and now she's going to have to start all over again. But all right, so the court says, don't discuss the matter with anyone. Don't form any final opinions about it. We'll see you back at 1:30, and I will see you guys back here on Thursday, tomorrow. And I don't know what day I'm recording this and what day it's scheduled for. I think Thursday. So I'll see you guys then, and take care. Thank you so much for watching, and let me know what you think. Please like, subscribe, comment, and I'll see you guys later. Bye, guys.